It's Friday morning. Glad you've joined me. I'm doing this like a newscaster, getting all their notes together. We are in Jonah. It's the fifth of the minor prophets, and it's the most famous of the minor prophets. If you went to church growing up, like me, or you've been around church long enough, you know about Jonah. Jonah was swallowed by a big fish, a great fish, the Bible tells us in Jonah. But there's more to the story than that. By the way, this is really interesting to me. We are on Friday. And Friday is typically eat fish only. That goes way back in church history. In the Catholic Church, which we all came from eventually, they decided not to eat meat on Friday to commemorate the Lord's Supper, and the Lord's death. And so they didn't eat meat. It was kind of a fast from meat on Fridays, but they considered fish not a red-blooded animal they could eat on Fridays. So I remember growing up going, hey, it's Fish Friday. I had no idea why. But here we are on Fish Friday, and it's Jonah Day, who was swallowed by a fish. And I'm going to confess something to you. I'm not going to vary from the outline of Jonah. There's 4 chapters in Jonah that I heard from my Old Testament college professor, Dr. Robert Black, who's a great guy. He's passed on by now, of course. But 37 years ago in his class, he gave me this outline of Jonah. Chapter 1, Jonah runs from God. Chapter 2, Jonah runs to God. Chapter 3, Jonah runs with God. Chapter 4, Jonah runs ahead of God. I'm going to tell you the story here in just a moment. We have a lot of information about Jonah. Actually, we find him in 2 Kings 14:25. He was a prophet during the time of Amaziah, who was the king in the northern kingdom, around 750, 740 BC-ish, somewhere in there. But he prophesied to Jeroboam, who was the king of Jerusalem and Judah at that time. And of course, there was all kinds of assaults from Assyria, the northern kingdom, Syria and Assyria, coming down into Israel all the time, trying to mess with them, mostly because God allowed it because of their sins. But the great city of the Assyrians was Nineveh. Think of the capital city of any major world power ever: London, Rome, Hong Kong. I mean, just think of any world power, and the power of the world center. Nineveh it's in modern day Iraq. It was the power, it was the king, it was the wealth of all paganism. God comes to Jonah in chapter 1 and says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for the evil has come up before me. Jonah runs. He goes as fast as he can to the port town of Joppa, modern day Jaffa, which we've been at before, and he gets on a ship to Tarshish. You know the story. If you don't, read Jonah. Jonah is a great book you can read today on your own. You can read to your kids. It's not boring. And here's the message. Jonah flees from God. God says, well, I'm going to get your attention somehow. A storm comes up. They throw him overboard. He's swallowed by a great fish. Chapter 2 of Jonah finds Jonah in the belly of the fish, the whale. And in verse 7, he has this prayer. He's actually speaking to God. He says, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. And it's really interesting. Maybe some of you guys are experiencing this in our hard time now that we're going through this trying time of everything's not in order. We don't have our jobs. We don't have normal life and circumstances. And it's a good time to turn to the Lord. Jonah says, well, I nearly died and drowned in the ocean or in the Mediterranean Sea. Now I'm going to turn to God and see if he'll do something gracious. I love verse 10 of chapter 2. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out on the dry land. So then Jonah goes, well, okay, God spared my life. Now I'm going to go do what God told me to do. I'm running from God. I run to God because I'm in dire straits. Chapter 3, he runs with God. And verse 4 says, Jonah began to go in the city a day's journey, and he called out, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God, and they called for a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest of them to the least of them. Even the king of Nineveh humbled himself and repented for the evil that they had done. I call this the greatest sermon in the history of the world. It's simply 7 words, and the entire city repented. It was something God was doing. God is showing us something about his grace and about his mercy here, because the whole city repents. And I love this in verse 10 of chapter 3. It says, when God saw what they did, how they turned from the evil way, God relented from the disaster that he had said he would do, and he did not do it. Now, verse 4:1 gives us some insight into Jonah. This displeased Jonah. Jonah, truthfully, even though he's a mouthpiece for God, even though he's a prophet of God, he wanted to see the destruction of Nineveh. He relished in the judgment to come upon them. What he didn't count on was the grace and the mercy of God against even these people that he didn't like. I love the last verse of Jonah, verse 11. I mean, again, Jonah is whining and complaining and crying. Why didn't you do what you said? I went and preached. It's like, Jonah, you kind of did, and you fled first, but he went and preached, and then God says, hey, I'm gonna take the repentance. They repented, I'm not gonna judge them. And Jonah's like, I'm so ticked off I could die. And God says, should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left? This is a city of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And God goes, I want to be merciful. I want to have pity on them. It's interesting because in Jesus' ministry, some people are coming up to Jesus saying, show us a sign. Show us that you can do something awesome. In Matthew 12:40 through 41, he goes, I'm not going to show you a sign except the sign of Jonah. Jonah was 3 days in the belly of a fish, and so will the Son of Man be 3 days in the body of the earth, and he'll rise again. He goes on and he says, Jonah's going to rise at the resurrection, and he's going to judge you because Nineveh repented at his preaching, and now one greater than Jonah is here, Jesus Christ. So here's the question for you today on this Friday. Maybe you're eating fish, maybe you're not. Are you running from God? Are you running to God? Are you running with God? Or are you running ahead of God? Whatever it is, let's make Jonah chapter 3 our thing for the day. Let's run with God, because in the midst of running with God, we proclaim for him, and his great mercy prevails. God bless you. We'll see you tomorrow.